So we have the pleasure to have today Diego Aranha, who is an associate professor in the Department of Computer Science in Aarhus University. Diego's professional experience lies in cryptography and computer security, with a special interest in the efficient implementation of cryptographic algorithms and security analysis of real-world systems. He received the Google Latin American Research Award for research on privacy twice, and the MIT Tech Review's Innovators Under 35 Brazil Award for his work in analyzing and improving the Brazilian electronic voting system. It's an honor to have today Diego Aranha here in our CRC seminar series, and thank you all for being here. Diego, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francisco, for this invitation. We've been trying to arrange this for a while now, but we had to postpone a few times, but gladly everything worked out for today. So I won't be talking necessarily about recent work. As the name implies, this is a long time span about one particular research project I've been involved with, and I've been tracking since we stopped working on it a few years ago. I'll try to give an up-to-date impression on what it looks like. So of course, as the name says, is about the security of the Brazilian voting system, and it's joint work with too many people. I list the most recent collaborators on this slide. One thing I always tell people who get interested into practical electronic voting is, oh, you think cryptography is hard? You think that deploying cryptography is a big problem, a hard problem to solve? Well, electronic elections are way harder. We have to deal with non-trained users, just the voting population. There's a lot of contamination from politicians and other agents with political interests. The security requirements are somewhat conflicting because you need to, as we will discuss in the next slides, we need to both provide ballot secrecy and integrity, which in a sense go against each other. It's very easy to check the integrity of an election that doesn't have voter privacy. Right, so this sometimes make it harder. The threat model is quite powerful. We assume malicious insiders. We assume powerful adversaries with a high budget, able to fuel political campaigns. So that goes into the billions for large countries these days. And it's also a very high stake process that you run once. If you run an election and the outcome is not clear or is not transparent to the population, that might affect the credibility of that process forever. So you need to get it right every single time. So the task here, we should appreciate for how challenging it is, which doesn't mean that you shouldn't try your best to make it secure and transparent, but it's not simple. That's an important disclaimer. So in the previous slide, we talked about the security properties. What do we mean by that? Any voting system, if it's paper-based or e-voting based, should satisfy these guarantees. It should provide eligibility, which means that only voters supposed to vote have a chance of voting, and also fairness. So voters shouldn't have access to early results that could influence the way they vote. We typically leave this until the voting session is done, when outcome can be published, and then we know the results. As we said, we need ballot secrecy and integrity. The system should protect voters from coercion to some extent. It should also inspire public confidence through transparency, and also should allow both individual agents to verify that their votes were cast correctly, typically the voters, but also universal verifiability, which means that an entity can inspect the products of an election and conclude that it was done according to the protocol. So for all votes, not just individual votes or small samples of it. As we said, the threat model is quite tricky. The voters can be malicious. The poll officers who work for the electoral authority can be malicious. Politicians can be malicious. Insiders can be malicious. Everyone can be malicious in this, right? So it's one of the hardest threat models we have in applied cryptography, if you think about it. It rivals or competes with anonymizing networks for the hardest threat model out there. So in the context of the Brazil case, I can say that Brazilian elections are quite special. First of all, they are massive. We have around 140 million voters. Because voting is mandatory, the turnout is really high, so it reaches on the 81%. I think this was the previous election. Elections are held every 2 years. We alternate between municipal and federal elections. which have different threat models as well. In one of them, of course, in municipal elections, you worry more about politicians with local power. In federal elections, you worry about malicious insiders who could tamper election results on a much bigger scale. E-voting was implemented after many reports in the 80s and the 90s about fraud in the paper-based system. I can claim that these were typically small scale. In particular, there was a logistic decision that made it easy to defraud that system. You wouldn't do what we call precinct counts. You wouldn't start counting the ballots of a certain polling place immediately after the voting session would finish. These ballots would first be transported to some big place to count all of them together. And of course, that increases the attack surface quite a bit. And political agents took advantage of that to make some votes disappear or appear magically, or even fill blank votes and stuff like that during the counting. So there are many reports of small-scale fraud that motivated the country to to be one of the pioneers, actually, of adopting e-voting in 1996. So in 1996, this started as a pilot project covering a fraction of the polling places, and then it became fully electronic in 2000, the dawn of the new century. One thing that's also very remarkable about Brazilian election is that a single entity, part of the judicial branch, part of the Supreme Court, actually, does everything about elections. They control elections in the sense of specifying protocols and how the whole procedure actually works. They execute elections on the election day by recruiting political inspectors, recruiting poll officers, distributing the machines, collecting the results, and publishing the outcome. And they also judge any disputes. So if some candidate felt that the elections were not fair and they start an action on the judicial system, this will at some point end up in their table. So they do the whole pipeline regarding elections and also judges any dispute that arises with the results, right? Which of course, as I will claim later, creates conflicts of interest in many, many places. So this is the Brazilian voting machine. Not the most recent model, but it's close enough. So you can see it's the model from 2009. So it's basically what we call a DRE voting machine. By DRE, I mean a direct electronic recording voting machine, which means that votes are cast on the device and tallied on the same device. They're counted on the same device. So the device keeps track of how many votes go to each candidate. At the end of the day, they will produce some kind of record attesting to those vote counts that are then aggregated with the other polling places in the country to arrive to the final result. The voters identify themselves by putting their fingerprints in this sensor here. This is a terminal used by the poll officer to authenticate voters. So they actually, if you as a voter has fingerprints enrolled into the system, you can actually put your finger here and hopefully you will be recognized. And then this will actually emit a signal to the voting machine saying that you are eligible for one vote. And the first problem we can already see from a design perspective or a philosophical perspective is that these two terminals are connected by a cable, as you can obviously see, which means that the same device, the voting machine, knows what the voter identity is and also collects that particular vote. So these two pieces of information that are obviously critical for breaking ballot secrecy are in the same device's memory at some point. So it's up to the software running the device to not leak that association by any means, than to preserve ballot secrecy. So if you look at other designs out there, you won't see the same feature because that's not actually a feature. It's more like a bug or design flaw. Some quick facts. So these voting machines, again, are paperless. They are electronic records only, were introduced in 2000 in the national scale, but claiming to be 100% secure since the beginning. So from the beginning, we had propaganda and pieces saying, you know, this is the most secure system ever, much better than the paper system. But these claims were not really tested until 2012, when they started doing hacking challenges that I will let you know about. The hardware is still mostly manufactured by Diebold. Recently, other companies won the public bid to manufacture, but the hardware is specified by the electoral authority, by the Superior Electoral Court, the SEC. So then the hardware manufacturers do not have a lot of room to design things differently. The software is written by the SEC since 2006. Before that, the software was not, it was contracted, but then it became their task to do it in 2006. And it's a huge code base. We are in the scale of tens of millions of lines of code. This is the most recent number I could find in our papers. I suppose that nowadays is even bigger. In 2008, they migrated from Windows Compact Edition to Linux. So yes, we had presidential elections running in Brazil with voting machines also running Windows, which is not the most inspiring case ever. They briefly experimented with paper records in 2002. I'll tell, if we have time, I'll tell the history of this later on. But after a lot of pressure, they introduced or experimented with a fraction of the voting machines producing a paper record for the voter to check that this, the vote was cast correctly, or at least printed correctly. And then this would allow, at least for some polling places equipped with these paper records, a recount in case of dispute, which would allow verifying at least a sample of the polling places nationwide. They've been enrolling voters in the fingerprint identification system since 2011, and recently it reached half of the population, so that's still ongoing. But one thing that you can conclude from the fact that these machines are mostly paperless, or these days are essentially paperless, is that the system by definition is highly vulnerable against insiders. Because it's a software-only voting system, it depends on the guarantees provided by the software component, of course, to achieve any of the security properties we defined before. To provide eligibility, only allow authorized voters to vote, or to keep ballots secret, or to count them correctly. It's software dependent only, and it doesn't provide a paper record for you to check against the software and try to detect attempts of cheating or manipulating the software to cheat. So the workflow is like this. At the top here, we have the Superior Electoral Court again, who develops the software and performs any of the auditing measures that they claim to have at the development phase. And then at some point in time, they fix a version of the software to be their version to be used for elections. Then this is transmitted to the regional branches of the electoral court in each of the states. And then this, they use a VPN to send these packets from, or these packages of software from the electoral authority to the regional branches, which then are stored until a few days before the election. A few days before the election, this new version of the software that was just received is then loaded into memory cards that we'll call install cards, that then are used to install the voting machines. So the voting machines do not have internet connections or any network interfaces. They communicate with the outside world by physical media. So every election, they receive a version of the software to run on the election. They produce a set of files in what we call media of results. It's a pen drive, a USB drive, that you can detach from the voting machine and put on another computer to transmit the results through. And then after you do that, then you have the results of the whole country just to tally them and publish the outcome and wait for perhaps disputes or the need to perform some auditing procedures if that's the case. I'm using color here to actually rank the levels of transparency in the different parts of the process. So in the software development part, we don't have much transparency because, well, software is closed source. There is only tiny windows of time where independent inspectors can actually look at the source code and try to find vulnerabilities, like the hacking challenges I'll discuss next. During the voting phase, where voters show up between 8 a.m. and I think 5 p.m. on the election day to vote, there are some auditing procedures, but of course they don't cover software correctness. That wouldn't make sense. And then the last part, the transmission of results to the central templator, I can claim that it's fully auditable because the machines also print a paper record with per precinct or per polling place totals. And then when these results are received by the central tabulator, they are published online. So you can actually check what the voting machine printed in terms of partials and what was received. And if these two match, of course, there was no attempt to tamper or there was no successful tampering of the results. So you can then perform a recount or a retally based on the partials. That doesn't guarantee, obviously, that the partials contain the correct counts, because that depends, again, on the software behavior. So as I said, we install, or the country installs software a few days before the election. Typically one install card like this we will install about 50 different machines in a public ceremony. So it's done in open view, or at least the political parties can show up and try to make sure that this is done properly. Then when the the voting session starts, then machines print a zero tape. That's just a document saying no votes were cast before this amount or this instant in time. Then at 8 a.m., the voting session is open. Then the voters can authenticate and cast their votes. At 5 p.m., this is closed. Both the opening and the closing of the voting session are performed by typing a command in the poll officer terminal that we saw on the left-hand side of the picture previously. And then the machine will print the poll tape, which is, contains the partials just for that polling place. Then the files, a bunch of files is written to a USB drive. These include the digital version of the poll tape that is, of course, transmitted, something called a DRV that I will define later, and a log with all the events that happened since the software was installed up to this point, or at least the events that the software decides to put on the log, of course. So then this USB drive is detached from the voting machine and then plugged in a desktop computer running a Linux distribution that establishes a VPN connection with the central tabulator to transmit the contents. And then the national tally is done over more than half a million poll tapes in digital form, of course. And then the political parties can then try to match again, or inspectors can try to match what was printed and what was received. So after lots of pressure, the electoral authority decided to start doing what they call public security tests with objective of allowing external independent experts to look into the security of the system. They were very clear at the beginning that the objective was for the participants was to try to find an untraceable violation of one of the security properties, essentially breaking ballot integrity or breaking ballot secrecy. But it turns out that I participated in the second edition of this, the first one with access to source code, and our conclusion was that they were still extremely restricted. So you had a code base in the scale of tens of millions of lines of code, but you couldn't even use pen and paper to take notes. You would go to a room with computers with the source code pre-installed, and you could statically read the code and then memorize parts that you find interesting, but you couldn't change, recompile, take notes, or do anything. You had to memorize anything you would need. In the edition we participated, we had only up to 3 days to inspect the code. At the end, we could only use 4 hours out of those 3 days because another team had to use the same machines we were using, so we were kicked out. After you decided you had enough about the source code inspection, there would be a 2-week period where you would submit attacks to the electoral authority, and then after some of these were approved, then you could mount them against the real system in, again, public space with the presence of the press and other interested parties. Participants and attacks, as I said, were pre-approved, so they could veto who participates and what attacks are mounted. I never heard of any one or any attack being prevented from being conducted, but certainly they have this power. And one important thing is we got no guarantees about the software. Is this the correct version? Is this a recent version? Is this the same thing that's running the election? Of course, you get no such guarantees. You get a version of software without source control that they promise is recent, but you have to trust them to extract anything from this. So this already shows that there are some intrinsic conflicts of interest here. They are organizing an event to test the security of their own system. So maybe it's not in their best interest to do a really deep inspection of how secure the system is. So at least the two things are in conflict. At the time, they also claimed in multiple ways that Brazil was the only country doing this open evaluation of the voting system, which is obviously not true. For many years, we have the voting village in the US where people, essentially enthusiasts, would just buy voting equipment to break and hack during DEF CON. And just to contrast how different things are, in the left-hand side, you have a screenshot of the voting village a few years ago. This is actually a member of the electoral authority in Brazil attending to that event, so they know how it actually works. And you can see people freely tinkering with hardware and doing whatever they want. In the event we participated, the layout was this. We were group 1. This is the 2012 event. We were group 1. we had the two copies of voting, we had two voting machine models here to play with, and a computer to type code or maybe tamper with memory cards and so on. And we could only inspect the source code on the back of the room. So there were some computers there with the source code loaded that we could take turns into inspecting under their supervision. And in particular, these machines didn't have internet access to not leak the code, I guess. Our machines did not have internet access. You could only actually access the internet through these other machines on the side. So it was very pretty much restricted. There is a metal detector preventing you from going in with any kind of physical media to prevent, I guess, leaking the source code again. So in this first engagement, we found already serious vulnerabilities. I will explain how we found them, but in a particular mechanism that does vote shuffling. So basically, whenever a voter votes in this voting machine, the record of that vote, the digital record, is shuffled together with the other votes in a table. So it goes into a random position in this table. So we found a way to reverse that shuffling. We also found that the internal memories of these machines were encrypted, but the keys were the same for all machines. That's the same key for 500,000 devices. That's a lot. And it was also stored in source code. So, of course, extremely insecure, because then it could be stolen by any attacker with access to source code or binaries coming from that. We found out the integrity mechanism was also very fragile. The voting software would check itself by checking signatures computed over itself during the boot process. But that's very fragile because, of course, if you tamper the voting software to not check signatures, it will still go through without giving you guarantees that it's correct. You need some external root of trust to be able to bootstrap this properly. So after exploiting at least the vote shuffling mechanism and observing the other design flaws, we concluded that, the system doesn't satisfy the requirements of ballot secrecy or integrity, because the software doesn't satisfy those, and one thing is inherently linked to the other. And we also concluded that it could only come from an insecure development process without a lot of external inspiration or external knowledge being inserted. The threat model was quite inadequate as well, because it could only consider external attackers. So insider attackers were never considered in the design, I would say, from how the security mechanisms are actually designed. And by interacting with them, it was pretty clear that the internal culture didn't really favor transparency. So it was more on the other way. Let's have things hard to find out and obscure such that attackers cannot find them. So how does this process work? The vote shuffling mechanism I told you about. So we assume here an election with 3 different races for governor, senator, and president. A voter votes for each of them. And then we have this table that's kept in the machine's memory and in the machine's physical media for it to be extracted later, in which if a voter voted like this, maybe 13 for governor, 31 for senator, and blank for president, a different position in each of these columns is picked for storing each of these votes. And then a second voter will vote like this, and a different position again is picked. And then at the end, 3 voters voted out of 7, and that gives you the final view of the file. And some things are pretty clear here. If you have a secure way of generating randomness to sort or to find these random positions in the table, of course, at the end, you cannot link who voted to the votes they cast. That should be pretty clear. The other thing that's interesting is these gray parts that correspond to absentees were preserved. So the final version of the file still had holes for no votes because maybe less people voted than the total number for that polling place. All of these are useful later on. So this file has an interesting story. I told you that in 2002, they tried to experiment with paper records, and then they decided it was a horrible idea. They needed a digital replacement. The arguments were like, printers are expensive, they jam, you need extra personnel to fix printers, and voters are confused about this paper record, so none of this works. That was their conclusion. So then they replaced the paper record with this file, trying to mimic what you have with paper. If you have paper ballots, of course, they might fall in order, but before you count them, it's typical to shuffle the ballot box really hard such that they mix, so they don't fall in order. So they try to do approximate the same thing, but they're just picking shuffling positions to store the votes and prevent them from the order in which they were cast to be recovered. So this file is somewhat of public access. The political parties which request this file, get copies of it if it's approved. And they claim that because you have the vote counts and the files containing the votes in a shuffled order, this allows a recount, which is obviously not true because recount must be independent of the software. In this particular case, it would be trivial to manipulate software to both count incorrectly, but also store votes that would match the incorrect, the defrauded count in this file in a shuffled order. So it all depends up to the software in the same way as before. So at the end, this file is just redundancy that increases the attack surface as we claimed. So yeah, it doesn't allow recounts. So in 2012, we got a machine with millions of lines of code. We didn't know where to start, but we attended the talk that they gave where they explained this process. So we thought that we had the starting point to start cryptanalysis, right? We have to break random number generation. So maybe warning, there will be some sophisticated math afterwards about how to break this shuffling process. We didn't know where to start, so we started from really low hanging fruit. Let's just grab the whole code base for rand and see where randomness might come from. If we can find how to generate this randomness, we might do that after an election and then recover the votes in order. If we know in which order the voters voted, we break ballot secrecy for a whole polling place. That was the idea. Maybe to our surprise, we found a hit in a file called drv.cpp. So there was a call to the rand function in C inside that file. The name is very suggestive, of course. It actually implements the mechanism I just showed you. But then it depends on the seed, right? Rand is not a great random number generator, but the most problematic part of that API in C is actually the seed. That's too short, it's just 32 bits long, and typically chosen horribly. So when we look at the seed, it was actually a time measurement in seconds using the time function that gives you how many seconds from January 1st, 1970 have passed. Which allow us already to constrain the seed space a lot. Because if you know when this time measurement was done, maybe it's during the initialization of the machine, that gives you a whole hour of seeds. That's just 3,600 seeds. It's not a lot, right? And then we thought, okay, now we have an attack. We can actually try all seeds that correspond to seconds in the first hour where the system is initialized. Try to store k out of n votes, and see if we get one seed in which the holes match the polling place you're attacking. If the holes match, you probably have the right seed or a seed candidate that could be correct. At the end, we didn't have to do any of this because they printed the time when the time was taken, the time was measured. So our attack was just go into a public file, look at this time here, so you know when the machine was initialized, you convert this to seconds, you have the seed. Of course, if you have the seeds, you know how votes were stored in a shuffled order. You can recover them with 100% precision in the order that they are cast. So that's already pretty bad. At the end of the tests, or after the test, a few days after, we also discovered that the log files, that's also public file, it stores a timestamp for each voter. So you know that voter 1 voted at 1 a.m. and second voter maybe voted at 5 minutes past 8 and so on, which actually amplifies their vulnerability in a simple way. I'll just show one example. How that works. How does that work? This is the Supreme Court president in 2010 voting. And by the picture that they publish on their own website, we know that he voted at this time. So with this timestamp, you actually can look at the log and look at the position this person voted in the voting query. Let's suppose that it was position 50. There were 49 voters before this person. And then if you can recover the votes in order, obviously you go to position 50 and you know exactly how the Supreme Court president voted, or the electoral authority president voted in 2010, which obviously we didn't do because we would probably end up in jail. But all the conditions are here, right? You just need access to public files, figure out a timestamp, see the PRNG, recover the votes in order, break ballot secrecy for politically targeted voters with high accuracy. So there's no defense in depth. After this whole thing happened, the initial repercussion or the initial response from them was positive. They said that, oh, this is an extremely positive contribution to the system. It's a highly advanced technological attack, which I took as a compliment because I don't think I had another option. They learned a lot of this attack that could only be mounted by PhDs. That was what they said to the press. At the end, things were not as nice. They published a report appreciating our attack, which had at the time like ranking criteria, grading criteria. And then the first thing that they said was our attack was not an attempt at fraud, was just at causing failure, as in a DOS attack, which doesn't make any sense. They also said that we needed physical access to voting machines, media, seals, and the source code to pull this off, which is not true. We needed access to a voting machine to simulate an election to show the attack worked. But in practice, you just look at the files that the machine produces to mount this attack. So at the end, by telling all of this, they gave us a really, really low grade. The maximum grade could be 400. We got like 0.03. I think it's the lowest grade I ever had in my life. So at the time we concluded, it was trivial to recover the votes in order, trivial to recover a specific vote cast at a specific time that maybe belongs to a very powerful voter. And our recommendation was simple: eliminate this DRV file. It doesn't serve any purpose. It's just helping attackers to break ballot secrecy. And do not store metadata about the voters, like the timestamp they voted. They instead of following our recommendation, they fixed this by implementing a custom RNG. We only found out years later, that's seeded with the system entropy. So the RNG algorithm they picked is not good, is not peer-reviewed. At least the entropy they collect from the system appeared to be fine the last time we took a look. But it's puzzling that actually the voting machine has two hardware RNGs that could have been used, and they still prefer to deploy a custom software solution. At the end of the day, it's because not all voting machines have the same hardware RNGs, and they are obsessed with the idea of running the same software across all machines, which means that the security of the system ends up being downgraded to the worst machine in operation, the one with the least support to hardware crypto or secure crypto and so on. Then this was in 2002, in 2012. In 2014, they decided to not hold public security tests anymore. Maybe they were still dealing with the repercussion of this, which was made national news and was non-trivial. And then in 2016, they decided to organize the first public security tests after the one we participated, but they introduced a very strict NDA, which we refused to sign, so we couldn't participate. But I still participated as an external observer representing the Brazilian Computer Society, that's kind of the national ACM, as their observer. And I could see that other teams found the text. The most interesting one from a cryptographic point of view is this. I'll be very brief about it, where they saw that the poll tapes actually contain a checksum. And this is useful because if the voting machine breaks down and produces a partial result, you can use another system to type in the results manually. And you need to type in the checksums to make sure that you didn't tamper with the results you manually type in. But the problem, of course, is this is just a hash or a checksum. It's not a MAC. So they found that it was trivial to, if you know how this is computed, you could just change the votes for a particular candidate. And then typing the updated checksum, and the system would accept that and transmit that. And of course, that would defraud the integrity, would break the integrity of that polling place. So after that was found, they actually implemented a MAC, which is the right solution here. Of course, the checksum is not sufficient for an active adversary. But observe that so far, we haven't touched at the beginning the problems I posed at the beginning, that the integrity of the voting software is very fragile. It's checked by itself. So in 2017, they decided to hold yet another edition of these public security tests, now with a much better NDA that would only last a week. So after they would publish their report about your own work, then you were free to talk about what you saw. You've seen there were no restrictions other than, dealing with the law, if that escalates that far. But you were not prevented from talking about what you've done. And then we decided to participate again and now use software installation as an attack vector. They claim that the software installation process is done in a secure ceremony that's observable by everyone and so on. So then there is no attempt, there's no possibility of tampering with it. So you can see from the picture that, it's not the most harmonious place in the universe, right? You see a lot of school students looking at it and people confused and not knowing what to do. And they're installing very sensitive software that will run an election nationwide scale. So it depends on this ceremony being done properly without malicious interference. So we wanted to try that. So to understand how integrity checking worked on the system, we had to deal with lots of cryptography. That's expected, right? E-voting implies cryptography. It's just different than what we used to. So we found out that the install cards, the cards that contain software that's installed in the machines, are encrypted with AES on a tweaked XTS mode. So they changed slightly the XTS mode, maybe making it less secure to encrypt these install cards because they're obsessed again with obscurity or obfuscation. The key that installs this is embedded in the kernel that you boot the cards from. So you boot the machine from these cards, the key is in the kernel, it decrypts the file system. To prevent the files in the file system after decryption to be tampered with, they have digital signatures, both verified in user land and also kernel mode. So there are redundant signatures verified at different places. In particular, the cards also contain the keys that sign the results. When the voting machine produces results, it signs them such that when they are received by the tabulator, they know they come from legitimate voting machines, or at least they have the right signatures. So they are encrypted under a different key also embedded in the kernel. So it looks like this. When you boot the machine, you boot through a bootloader, of course. The bootloader would decrypt a kernel image that's encrypted with this with AES in ECB mode. Don't ask me why. The key, of course, for decrypting the kernel was embedded into the bootloader. The kernel then had keys to decrypt the file system and the set of authentication keys using different versions, operation modes for AES for both, plain files and also the keys that sign the results. So that's the chain of trust when you boot the machine. So in 2017, when we participated again, they said on the call for participation that researchers would have access to all source code except cryptographic keys. And that made me optimistic. I thought, okay, if we won't have access to cryptographic keys, it's because maybe now they are secured properly. Maybe they are stored in a secure place this time. At the end, when we had access to the source code, it was just because they deleted the keys from the source code. They were still there, but not visible to us. So obviously, vulnerable to insiders, but not to us as participants operating under the restrictions they posed. But you still have to try the low-hanging fruit again. So we just had access to the code base. We just looked for keys. And it turns out that they had 2 copies of the kernel code base, and they forgot to delete the keys in one of them. So in the other one, we actually found the keys just defined in plain text on the driver for the file system. So we could just find something with exactly this structure, this byte is even correct about the key used at the time. So of course, if you have the key, you decrypt the file system. That's exactly what we did. So we broke this part of the chain of trust by decrypting the file system. So then we could look at what happens in terms of integrity verification for the software loaded from the file system, and maybe try to escalate things from there. So the authentication chain looks like this. Actually, some voting machines, at the time not all of them had, this has changed, had a sort of AGSM device that they call MSD. This MSD will check the integrity of the bootloader using an ECDSA signature. And this bootloader will check the integrity of both the shared libraries and the binaries stored in the file system by verifying RSA signatures. And also there are redundant signatures that come from ElGamal instantiated with elliptic curves that are also checked by this MSD. So there are multiple signatures, redundant signatures, attesting the integrity of these files. So when we could decrypt the install cards and look deeper, we found that actually there were 2 shared libraries that didn't have signatures because they just forgot to sign them. One of them to deal with the log files, to produce the logs, and the other to implement HKDF. If you do crypto, you immediately understand that this is complicated because it generates symmetric keys. So then if you have control over that, you can choose what the keys look like, and then you, of course, can decrypt. So we found that, and of course, if you have shared libraries without signatures, you can inject your own code on these files to run in the machine. We also found that there was a problem with kernel-side verification of RSA signatures, in which they would have some function to verify the signatures, and that function would actually return an unsigned int return code that could indicate an error or not. And this return code was actually compared with 0, which is always true for unsigned ints. That means that all signatures, including wrong signatures, were valid. So we could just tamper with files, with these files, and bypass both the file system check and the kernel check because of these problems. So then we could just use those 2 libraries that were linked against the voting software to actually inject code in real time in the voting software to change the instructions that were executed. And then we had fun with this. So we broke this particular edges in the chain of trust, both these redundant signatures here and signatures attesting integrity of shared libraries. So what did we do with this? First, we were able to manipulate how the logs were produced by injecting code directly on the library responsible for doing that. We tampered with the key that encrypts the DRV in memory, such that we could decrypt and even decrypt subsequent versions of the file to look for differences and then break payload secrecy for those additional votes. We could plug in a keyboard and issue commands to the voting machine, because now we could just load the driver and do that. We changed the software to actually change what was visible to the voters on the screen. And we also manipulated how votes were stored. We actually had the version of the software that would miscount votes that we were loading into our voting machine minutes before the end of this. It would close at 6 p.m. We had to stop what we were doing because they told us you cannot proceed. It stopped. That's it. I still claim that by having control over the software, it's an obvious consequence that you can miscount votes or manipulate how votes are counted. And we showed multiple times through multiple different ways that we had control over the software through these unauthenticated shared libraries. I think the most dramatic attack was exactly this one. So this is the screen of the voting machine under the simulation. We actually injected code to change this string here that just says your vote goes to just advertise a certain candidate, right? So the idea was that that's a small difference that would actually influence voters in, of course, a certain way that would be scandalous if it happened in a real election. And it was simpler than miscounting votes. But we were loading the vote manipulation attack as time was ending, and we were not allowed to proceed. So the conclusions were, again, these install cards were encrypted insecurely, because the keys are, again, visible to attackers who can find them in the source code or in the binaries if they have access to that. The integrity checking mechanism is also insecure. The vote checks itself. So if parts of the vote, the voting software are not properly checked, of course, you can use that as an attack vector. And in particular, another team participating in these tests also found a copy of this encryption key that encrypts the file system without source code by just loading the card in a virtual machine and inspecting the memory contents. They could just find the key there and decrypt. So their attack together with our attack makes this attack independent of source code access, which I think illustrates that, you know, preventing people from accessing source code is not sufficient, obviously. So in 2017, they had an obstacle that not all machines had the MSD, the HSM device, as part of the motherboard. So they had to find a mitigation, which was not very clean. What they did was they kind of fixed it by deriving the keys from a secret that's embedded into the kernel and contents of the BIOS. And this gives you the key that decrypts the file system, but still the same key for all voting machines. And of course, that's still quite vulnerable to insiders who can just run this in controlled manner and obtain the key. So that's not a fix. That's not even a mitigation. It's just obfuscation, I would say. In 2020, they purchased more voting machines, and in particular, the collection of voting machines now, all of them had the HSM, the MSD device I told you about. So then they actually could fix it properly, not maybe by doing the most elegant key management, which would be maybe use different keys for different parts of the country and so on. They just moved the keys inside this HSM. But it turns out that I was reading the reports from the security test that happened last year, and a team still managed to exfiltrate, to extract the key that encrypts the kernel, which could maybe allow some of this to still be functional. So the attack was maybe properly addressed in 2022, but parts of it were still resurrected last year. So then making 10 years of an attack that was never really fixed because of key management difficulties. That's not an easy problem to solve. So from all of this, what can we conclude, right? The elections are based in software that's mostly secret. Only political inspectors in a particular window and some universities have access to source code. That has been the truth for more than 20 years. The software was demonstrated to be insecure in multiple occasions. There is not a physical record for performing recounts. There is no really effective means to audit the system other than the transmission and telling of results at the end. I showed many examples of conflicts of interest when you want to contribute to make the system more secure or inspect if it's operating properly. And insider attacks are still mostly disregarded, I would say. How do you solve this? The actual solution is what we call software independence. You introduce a mechanism that doesn't depend on software, that basically prevents any flaws in the software when exploited and are not detected to actually cause undetectable mistakes or errors in the outcome. That's as simple as that. You can do this through different means. The cheapest and easiest to understand, of course, is using a paper record. Another way is to implement end-to-end verifiability by using fancy cryptography. In any case, you can actually run something called a risk limiting audit, in which you count a sample of the paper record to verify if it matches the tally with statistical significance. So you can do this, and if the election is not super tight, you can actually count a very small fraction of votes to get assurance about the result. And at the end, I still think that engaging the society and technical community to help improving software is important too, because also increases transparency. So that's how other countries have solved this problem. You get India on the left-hand side with a paper record, and also the scanners used in the US for voting, which are both software independent systems. How do you not solve this problem? Of course, by voting through the internet. You have a much bigger attack surface and the danger of coercion, which in Brazil is very real. So that will never work there, no matter how fancy and sophisticated the system is, because you can only coerce the voters where they are. And certainly not using what we used to call blockchain voting, that have other limits in terms of privacy and what can be verified. So in terms of future, what should be improved here? We really need in Brazil a mechanism for software independence that will improve the security of the system, such that undetectable attacks will not cause undetectable errors in the results. We need software to be open source and auditable to increase transparency behind the system, and that will serve as a social control mechanism such that society can participate more in the process. And I think that's extremely important, especially right now, because of all the political polarization there. Brazil is mimicking the US in how society is polarized these days. So it's quite critical that elections can be verified independently, such that, conspiracy theories do not have a future. And I think that's most of what I had to say. I'll just stop here. Maybe we have questions, and if time allows, and maybe those will come up with during the questions, I can talk about the political angles that have manifested in the last few years. Thank you so far for your attention.
Thank you very much, Diego, for this super interesting talk. We already have a question here. Let me read it. Fabio Campos is asking, who decides how the system security checks are carried out, and how is the restricted access to the code system justified?
So the electoral authority decides it. They decide everything, including this. And of course, they will take decisions that maximize their own interest in an outcome, right? The outcome they want, of course, is for the system to be considered secure, such that they continue the effort of claiming it's the best system implemented in the whole planet. How do they justify not having access to the source code? Back in the day, they actually justify by just saying that if the software is secret, it cannot be exploited. It's the usual claim you would hear in the 90s everywhere. These days, they have changed on a bit. They have committed multiple times to releasing the source code publicly in some form, but they never really fulfilled that promise, so we're still waiting. So there is no justification, because they already claimed to the press that software would become public or open in some manner. The best that they made was actually allowing 3 universities in the country to have a copy of the source code that we also don't know how recent is and how accurate it is. We don't know if it's the real copy, right? It's very hard to verify this without trusting them to do the right thing.
Thank you, Diego. We have another question by, we have many questions. We have another question by Javier Berbel. He is asking us, asking you, what do you think about the idea of using linkable ring signatures for nationwide elections?
Well, if I understand the limitations there are, they need to be anonymized as well, right? You just don't need linkable, you need linkable ring signatures. That where the anonymity comes from. I'll just claim something simpler. There are many cryptographic solutions that look beautiful on paper to solve problems like this. Deploying them and dealing with the key management that arises from that is the hard part. And most importantly, convincing the people that the mechanisms you deployed actually work it's also very challenging because the voters won't have a training in cryptography. The political inspectors that will look at the system won't understand what's going on. So that will always pose a limit. You can all think about some fancy cryptographic voting to solve all these problems, but explaining to the population how it actually works is a big obstacle that should not be undermined if we want the public to actually trust the system and not just believe propaganda.
Thank you for the answer. One more question from Juan Grados. He's asking you, is the custom RNG algorithm public? You mentioned they use checksum. Do you know which algorithm they used?
So for that checksum, it was just a custom algorithm they made. It was like a SHA-256, modified SHA-256. Now they use zip hash as a MAC, as far as I remember, because it gives you a short checksum, which should be sufficient for what they need. The custom algorithm that they implemented was pretty close to a particular algorithm we found online on someone's website. Literally was like a hobbyist who published, oh, I designed this very fast random number generator, and here it goes, and you can use it. So they took that, did some tweaks, they always do that, and deployed that as the new RNG. So it didn't receive any serious peer review, and I think there were emails claiming it was broken as well. But none of that was in the scientific record because, yeah, they didn't care about that. It was just like literally someone's algorithm posted in their website.
Okay, thank you. We have one more question from Daniel Escudero. He's asking you, were there non-Brazilian researchers involved in the study the system?
That's a good question. No, because that's not allowed. So in multiple occasions, other e-voting researchers tried to participate, and by the call for participants, this is not allowed. You need to be a Brazilian citizen to participate. And in some occasions they prevented. There was one particular occasion where, yeah, I claim that we didn't know of people who didn't, let me correct that, people who were not accepted to participate in this. Rodrigo Branco, he's a security researcher that worked for Intel at the time. He tried to participate and was blocked under the claims that because he works for Intel, that poses national security risks. So I would expect that to extend to Brazilians living abroad, which obviously trivially makes me out of the pool of candidates as well, because they worried about Intel, I guess, stealing their technology.
So if even Brazilians living abroad are not allowed?
That has happened once.
Wow.
Yeah.
We have an anonymous question here. With so many flaws in the system, how to change that? Why there is no political interest to change the current system?
So that's a hard question, which I don't think I have an answer. I would say that at first, because it's, well, if the entity responsible for changing that is the entity collecting the results of running elections, right? So there is I would say that this is caused by the inherent conflict of interest. It would be expensive to improve this, in the sense of you need to open the source code and people will look at this, and this will take years for, a lot of conspiracy theories will certainly come from the source code because that's what happens these days. You need to deal with all of that, and that's costly, right? And they have to do this while running elections, which is not easy. So it's very convenient for them to not change this, to claim that they are also efficient in terms of cost, and just push the problem to the future. So if we had two different institutions, most countries have something like that. The judicial branch will actually check part of the executive branch that's running elections. That's how it happens in the US, most places, most countries in Europe. Then at least you have the tripartite Republican tension to make sure that one entity inspects the other. Here, everything's in the same building under the same hierarchies. So it's very convenient for them to just not do anything. That's, I guess, my pessimistic answer.
Thank you. The questions keep coming. There is one more question by Gora Ash. He's asking you, what's your impression about the security of the US voting machines?
So, very good question. I didn't really mention this much, but we had one, sometimes I say this and I think it's true. Brazil likes to mimic bad things about the US with a few years of lag, of delay. So the problems we see here are very similar to the same problems discovered in US voting machines a decade earlier. If you look at the papers in the early 2000s by Alex Haldeman, Matt Blaze, and others, it's the same problems, right? Like bad entropy, bad key management, no paper record, no integrity checks that are based on a strong root of trust. So all of these are the same because there are also classical computer security problems. What happened in the US was there was a much stronger public pressure and organization of academics, I would say, and security experts that pressured government into adopting other systems, at least in most of the countries. So if you look at the US now, the only non-trivial fraction of voting machines that still operate there actually have a paper record. Most of the countries running on scanners, where you use the physical record as the means of registering your vote, so you can just recount it as many as you want, or what we've seen in the past elections with postal voting and other alternatives. The US is different is hard to compare with because you can have fragmentation. Different counties, even it's not even a state level decision. Different counties can use different systems. So you find a bit of everything. But it's very hard to find a polling place in the US these days without a paper record. It's, I think, above 90% of them have some physical record for recounts.
That makes a significant difference. One more question. What would be the AI? The question is how AI will play a role in this?
I don't see many ways. Maybe the best way, which also is problematic, is doing statistical analysis of the outcome to see if there is any pattern that looks suspicious or deviates from the expectation. But false positives there are quite problematic too, because you might get a false positive and then you claim that it could be fraud, and then it's too late already. So I think my answer is a bit cynical. I hope AI doesn't play a role in this. So maybe that's the answer I have. I don't think it's the right solution. I think the right solution is really empower the people. As much cliche as it sounds.
Okay, Diego. I have two quick questions because we are running out of time, but yep. I cannot refrain myself. I am curious. You mentioned in one of your last slides that internet voting is not the way to go, but isn't it a case of success? One of these small countries, correct me if I'm wrong, Estonia, yep, did it successfully? So the threat model for Estonia is different from the threat model from Brazil because coercion is not as relevant there. So in a country where you have very low levels of coercion, then internet voting can be a solution. You still have the problem that if this is proper cryptographic voting as it should be, how to explain to the population that this is how the system works and how you audit the system. And that has been a problem for Estonia, don't get me wrong. If you read at least the papers that were written about this, they also had problems with vulnerabilities auditing transparency requirements. Until recently, they also allow voters to vote in any of the two systems. You can vote through paper or through the internet, and even on both, and one would cancel the other, to allow people who are skeptic of the internet voting system to actually still vote. I think it was quite recently that the internet voting system there actually reached more than half of the total votes collected. So they're in this new reality where the internet voting system is the main voting system, but it's clear that it's an effort done very professionally for more than a decade by competent cryptographers. So I don't think you can say the same about the Brazilian system, unfortunately. Yes, thank you, Diego. And actually this comes with my second question. What would be the takeaway, Diego, for your very interesting talk? It's easy to get the idea that this cannot be done well. There is no way to do it in a right way, at least in the Brazilian context. Or please correct me if it's a bad conclusion. What will be your
So the definition of well changes, right? For the electoral authority in big parts of the population, this is just perfect because it's efficient. We get results on the same day, and no detectable fraud has been found at any recent election with sufficient scale, let's call it, right? So the definition of well changes. What I believe in, and I tell everyone I have the chance to, is that the solution here is actually less technology, and when you deploy technology, make it as simple as possible. Because at the end, what matters for elections is not only that the outcome is correct, but that can be independently verified and understood by everyone. Brazil is facing for years, I would say, the obstacle of disinformation campaigns, in particular started by the losing candidate of the presidential race. And it's very easy. I can even move some slides. Yeah, this is all some lessons learned. it's very easy to call fraud in a system that doesn't provide evidence for auditing, because there's just no way to find out if it's correct or not. If you just claim that there is a conspiracy involving the electoral authority to defraud the elections, no matter how many evidence you have to support that, this will just get traction because people won't understand how the system works. So my conclusion is that less technology is better, and be very careful when you implement technology in elections, because it's also very hard to roll back. If Brazil decided to roll back to paper ballots or something like that, it would be extremely problematic, because now you're restarting a system from scratch that people they don't trust, because they have heard of those stories from the past, and they have to get used to a new system again, and that will create all sorts of problems. So I would say less technology and more transparency, and make it simple and accessible. It's more important than cryptographers and people working on on the technical parts of it actually believe.
Okay. Thank you. The very, very last question by Eduardo Shoa. He's asking you, do you know if there is a mechanism to ensure that the information inside the memories is correct? He says ballot configuration.
I mean, in some voting machines, you actually have metadata that says how the ballot should be like. And there were attacks in the literature where instead of tampering with votes, you actually tamper with the configurations, right? For a scanner, you can actually tamper with the configuration that says like this particular oval here to be filled is a presidential candidate or something else. Or maybe calibrating the touch screen in which you touch on one button, but actually registering a voter for the other candidate because the calibration is done maliciously. I think it's very hard to actually protect this, because it depends on the hardware, on the configuration that's usually not authenticated through the usual means. The right way for doing this is actually have, you solve the other problem, you solve this problem by actually addressing the harder one, by making risk limiting auditing possible, in which you recount a small sample of the votes and check against the totals and get statistical assurance that there was no large scale fraud. You actually address this problem on the way as well. Because it doesn't matter if the configuration was correct or not. If the votes were cast correctly and can be audited with significance afterwards, then who cares if vulnerabilities were exploited? They didn't alter or they didn't change the outcome in any substantial way. And that's the main guarantee we want here, in a way that we can prove to a third party, not just based on the trust as assumption.
Okay, thank you very much. So we will let you go. Thank you, Diego. Hopefully you will be visiting us anytime soon. Let's see.
I hope to visit soon. Thank you very much for having me here. And I leave this slide with the references and papers if you want to read and get some depressing material to go through the weekend. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.